Hello students, this video is going to walk us through eco-criticism and animal studies, which is kind of part of the eco-criticism umbrella. A few things to know kind of at the beginning of studying eco-criticism. Eco-critics are specifically Earth-centered, not human-centered. So rather than thinking about humans as unique and special and different, they think about humans as very much part of the ecosystem, as one species among many species of animals, and that the Earth is kind of a top priority, so that to eco-critics, we should always be thinking about how our actions impact the entire planet. Some of the things they do is look at the representation of nature in texts, and we'll talk more about what that can mean. They also consider the hierarchies and value systems related to nature. So do we have a hierarchy that says that a developed space is better than a wild space, or vice versa? Or that a developed space has a different kind of value than a wild space? Eco-critics help us kind of think through those underlying values that we put on natural spaces and also spaces that humans have interfered with. Eco-critics, similarly to many of the other critical theorists, have a goal where they're looking for real-world results. And in the case of eco-critics specifically, they want to change the social conversation about nature to make us think more and better and differently about humans' role in the environmental crisis. So what they're doing isn't sort of just an intellectual exercise, it's about making real world changes. So one of the ways to start working our way into the topic is to think about how nature is represented. And this was one of the earliest strategies that eco-critics used, thinking about what nature looks like in different texts, in books, in poems, in film, in songs. What is nature meant to look like? So they've analyzed the connection between landscape and morality. If we look back at old Romantic era poems like William Blake poems, the natural untouched environment was considered pure and beautiful, and the urban environment was considered kind of tainted and dirty. So there is a whole layer of morality layered on top of the environment that people found themselves in. Eco-critics would also analyze the use of nature in a text. So is it being used symbolically, right? For example, when Tupac talks about a rose growing in concrete, he's not talking about a literal rose. He is talking about African American men raised in difficult situations who still turn into something beautiful. Eco-critics also ask if certain events can only happen in nature. If there is a story where there's like a reckoning with an evil character, like I'm thinking at the end of Snow White, when the witch falls off the cliff and there's a lightning storm, can that only happen in nature? And is there an indoor version of that would be as impactful? We can also think about whether or not nature is used as a projection of characters' fears and desires, right? Is nature kind of functioning for us as something that the character is wanting or is afraid of? So you might think about in Beauty and the Beast, when Belle is rushing up the hill in the beginning of the movie, and looking for adventure, she needs to be on her own in this beautiful meadow where she can see the wide world. It's being used as a projection of her desire for freedom. Another thing an eco-critic would argue is that we can always analyze nature in a text. They would argue that nature is everywhere, even if it's small. So it could be an ant. It could be a very small plot of grass on the sidewalk. But it is there no matter what. And that's kind of why I included this space of the before and after playgrounds here. There's very little nature to be seen in the left-hand version, but it is there. We can see a little bit of kind of like trees and maybe some weeds along the edge of the picture. And then the second picture, of course, is a much more appealing picture of how nature could fit into a playground. But an eco-critic would also ask us, if nature is not in a text, why isn't it there? Why is it absent? It's nature is literally the foundation of where we live. So if it's missing, why is it missing? Why has it been overlooked? And so these are the kinds of things that eco-critics start with as they are working into eco-criticism, whereas new eco-critics are working their way in. Eco-critics also criticize a concept called dominion. Um, this was a prevalent idea in the past, and some folks still hold this idea now, that humans have mastery over nature. So not only are we kind of special and different from nature, but that we are in charge of it. But an eco-critic would argue that unchecked dominion leads to exploitation, right? The humans using nature because they feel like it's their thing to use. It was put there for them to use. Um, so much so that things get destroyed, right? We see that in the number of species that have become extinct or endangered. Eco-critics began to question the idea of dominion, especially with the introduction of nuclear weapons. Humans had created a technology that could actually destroy the planet, like completely. And so they started to wonder whether or not we had the right to do that, right? Whether humans had enough dominion over nature to be able to destroy the whole planet. And an eco-critic would say no. And now, when they're analyzing nature, eco-critics consider the ways humans have intervened or affected the environment. So the image I used here is from Finding Nemo. I think it's a good illustration of dominion because Nemo was in the ocean minding his own business, and a human felt like he had dominion over the ocean to be able to take this fish and bring him and put him into a completely different environment of this aquarium. The whole film has a really kind of anti-Dominion message, right? The whole thing is about getting Nemo out, and we celebrate when that happens and when he becomes free. Um, the tricky thing is the film inspired so many people to buy clownfish, just like Nemo, that they actually started to become endangered in their natural habitats because so many people wanted them. So even though the film had what a sort of eco-critically friendly portrayal, it had also negative real world impacts that an eco critic would kind of unpack. Eco critics have really interesting analyses of nature, so they would think about how is nature constructed in the text? What kind of place is nature? What can happen there? What kind of words are used to describe it? What kind of words are used to describe humans in nature? They also look at the idea of sort of wild nature, right? We even see that in shows like Wild Alaska. Um, what is this construction of it being wild as compared to the less wild areas like Central Park, for example, still has a lot of nature but isn't wild, right? Or the zoo has a lot of nature but isn't wild. Um, Eco-critics examine the concept of wilderness. So what does that mean in the past? Is it a place to kind of conquer? Is it a place of danger? What does it mean to us now? How has that changed over time? And then how does that compare to other types of nature? The part that I find particularly fascinating is that eco-critics will examine anthropomorphism in depictions of animals. So anthropomorphism is whether or not the animal behaves sort of true to its species or whether it is a human in animal clothing. So Goofy, for example, and Pluto are both dogs in the Disney cartoon world. But Pluto behaves more or less like a real dog, whereas Goofy behaves like a human being who looks like a dog. Right? So they kind of look at that distinction really, really carefully to see why an animal might be anthropomorphized. Why is it being given human characteristics? Or kind of a flip, why do we have someone who is basically human but put in the shape of an animal? That's kind of what's going on here in this picture of Donald Duck at dinner with his nephews, um, eating something that is probably a duck or a turkey or a chicken. Um, Real ducks, to the best of my knowledge, are not cannibals and don't eat other poultry. Um, but in this case, we often let images like this sort of slide because we know Donald isn't a duck, even though he's shaped like one. Right? Donald is a human. So kind of similarly to the idea of anthropomorphizing an animal, um, is the idea of kind of hierarchy or value system. So hierarchy is a system of kind of like inferior at the bottom to superior, and Western culture has a lot of different hierarchies. So ego critics would think about the hierarchies of kind of human versus nature. They would think about the hierarchy of wild versus domestic. What are the value systems tied up in each of these things, which is better or worse than the other? Um, and that's why I included a picture from the book Charlotte's Web here. There's a character, Wilbur, who is kind of anthropomorphized amongst his fellow animals, although the human characters, except for maybe Fern, don't really notice that he's anthropomorphized, right? To them, he's just a pig. But he increases in value when something unusual happens, right? When Charlotte starts to spin these signs that say things like terrific or some pig, it gives Wilbur additional value, which ends up saving his life, right? He doesn't have to go to slaughter because he's done something or someone else has done something for him that makes him stand out from the others. So that's where we're kind of thinking about value systems, that the fact that um, he has kind of literacy on his side has made him more valuable than the other animals. And we're going to take a quick pause here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about other key eco critical concepts.